Welcome to Isaiah Berlin Day in Riga. This panel discussion is going to be called Surveillance and Freedom, and it's going to be about the tension between those two ideas. It has its roots in last year's Isaiah Berlin lecture when John Gray came to talk, and he was talking just after the Edward Snowden revelations in America, and it rather seemed from those as that privacy as we know it was either finished or on its way out in favour of at least the possibility of universal surveillance. And what was striking was that in Isaiah Berlin's philosophy, the highest of his values is what he calls negative freedom. I won't go here into the distinction with positive freedom, which I don't fully understand, but negative freedom essentially is the freedom not to be interfered with, the freedom to be left alone. And so, if we have no privacy, in Berlin's sense, do we have any freedom? Now, we put this to John Gray, and he said, in effect, well, it's happening anyway, it's irreversible, so we'll just have to learn to accommodate it. Which was a fairly terrifying but a very plausible thought at the time. However, it does seem to me that actually there's a lot more to be thought and said on that particular group of issues. Is it irreversible, for one thing? If it is irreversible, why is it irreversible? Are we letting something bad happen to us for no reason, or are there benefits associated with it? Is there some change in the priority of our values now, which makes us care less about freedom and makes Berlinianism somehow out of date? There are, I think, no definitive answers to these questions, but I hope that there are a lot of interesting things to say about them, and I'm pretty confident, based on the composition of the expert panel that we have here, that we are going to capture a lot of those thoughts, and it's a discussion I'm looking forward to very much. If I may introduce the panelists, Jānis Kažociņš is familiar to everyone here, I'm sure, as until recently, the head of the Constitutional Protection Bureau, the intelligence services for Latvia, and he's now advising the Defence Minister and the Foreign Ministry on security matters. Rafael Bēr is the political editor of the New Statesman in Britain. He may be known to some here as the Baltics correspondent of the Financial Times from some years back, so he is an old friend of Riga, and he will shortly be the political columnist of The Guardian. StjuartsArmstrongs is a James Martin Research Fellow at the Institute for the Future of Humanity at the University of Oxford. His academic background is in mathematics and genetics, and his particular field of interest is in the future of technology. And his colleague, Vincent Mueller, also a James Martin Fellow at Oxford University, has a background in philosophy, and his particular interest is in the philosophy of cognition and artificial intelligence. So I think we should be covering quite a lot of the frontiers of this debate, both how surveillance is practiced and why, how it plays out in the public and political sphere, what the fundamentals of it are, technological and social. And perhaps I'm looking forward also to Stuart's presentation, because he is going to persuade us that it does have some benefits as well as its more commonly discussed penalties. So, Janis, would you like to speak first? And we will have opening remarks of about 7 or 8 or 10 minutes, and then discussion. Janis.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. And as a former intelligence officer, of course, I understood immediately that I was here to defend the indefensible, that is surveillance vis-à-vis freedom. However, I think that there are, as Robert quite rightly said, a number of very interesting points which can be made. And what I'd like to do is to start off looking at the ethics of the issue very briefly, then look at the practicalities, one particular area, and that is legal intercept as it's practiced in Latvia. Consider which way that is going, and that leads us to follow on to the excellent discussion which we heard before coffee, and that is the whole issue of big data. So let's start, as one ought to, with definitions. Not very easy, but a common sense view of what is freedom, I think, could be summed up reasonably by what Franklin D. Roosevelt said in 1941, that he wanted to see a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Very interesting that these 4 overlap the 2 Isaiah Berlin categories, 2 being negative and 2 being positive freedoms, that is, worship and speech. Now, that leads us to start to think that perhaps freedom isn't very easy to define, and it could be argued that freedom is actually relative, because in different cultures freedom is seen in very different ways. So an African bushman will look at freedom quite differently from a Chinese communist, from a Republican Tea Party activist. It has been defined in very many different ways. Nietzsche talked about freedom as being the herd morality. Metternich said that freedom cannot exist without the concept of order. Hobbes, most famously, and I think relatively important for our discussion, spoke about the state of nature. And the state of nature is where we are constantly afraid that we're going to be robbed, that we're going to be raped, that we're going to be murdered, because everyone does what they naturally would want to do, which is why we have to give up a certain degree of freedom for our security. But then it's worth remembering that Hobbes lived in a period that saw the Spanish Armada threat to the United Kingdom and indeed the Civil War, so it's hardly surprising. Isaiah Berlin suggests that the modern perception of freedom has developed since the 17th century, but actually he also agrees that the Epicureans in the 3rd century BC also spoke about this, and they had a wonderful view, and that was that the greatest good, of course, is pleasure. Now, before we all run off to sign up to be Epicureans, it is worth pointing out that this actually is not the all-night parties, endless orgies, and drunken nights in small bars, but actually an absence of pain, physical and mental, the absence of anxiety, or the freedom from anxiety, or as we would call it in modern-day parlance, the freedom from stress. And one of the keys for them was that the gods, by their unpredictable behavior, were responsible for a lot of this anxiety. So the Epicureans said, oh, well, the gods live very far away, and they actually don't have anything to do with us, therefore we don't need to worry about them. And that made them much happier and gave them this absence of pain, which is pleasure. Now, modern life has many risks and threats for us. There is the risk of war, as we've seen very recently. There is the risk of terrorism. Therefore, security, both internal and external, are very important to all of us. Fanatics who murder are hailed as freedom fighters. The governments, it is said, have a duty to protect their citizens, and this leads us to this frontier between public authority and private life. It has been suggested that the frontiers of freedom, which nobody should be permitted to cross, actually exist. I wonder if they do. How much of our freedom should we surrender? And perhaps the real freedom is the right to choose. To be more specific, in March 2004, in Madrid, 4 bombs went off in 4 trains. They killed 191 people, 2,000 were wounded. Prime Minister Aznar at the time claimed that ETA was responsible. In fact, it turned out to be Al-Qaeda. This was a dramatic and drastic intelligence failure. In July 2005, the London 7/7 bombings killed 52 and injured around 700, 3 in underground carriages and 1 on a bus. These were homegrown terrorists, difficult to spot, but this is where surveillance has its action, has its point. Now, for a man in the street, these completely random, senseless acts of violence could be compared to the acts of the gods as seen by the ancients. So, legal surveillance is indeed, as an intercept, part of the intelligence solution. I would argue that it transgresses neither negative nor positive freedoms, because nobody is being forced not to do something, and everyone is allowed to do what they want within reason, within the law. The question, therefore, is how we use this intercept, and the key to that is adequate and credible control and oversight, and that has been the problem with the NSA. In Latvia, we have an extremely good system at the moment. It is run by the Constitution Protection Bureau for Legal Intercept for all law enforcement and special services. And it goes directly through ISPs, internet service providers, and mobile telephone operators. It is one-stop shop. It is very easy to control the warrants, and they are controlled regularly, at least once a month, by the Prosecutor General. There is a paper trail, and in the case of the journalist Ilse Jaunalksne, who was illegally, her mobile was illegally listened to, people responsible are called to account for it. However, there are examples I could give, but time doesn't allow, of why this has been extremely useful to society as a whole. What I have to say to you is that this system, as it exists at the moment, and which is in all our interests, is not going to be able to continue for very much longer, for 3 reasons. One is that genuine roaming is just around the corner, where ISPs and mobile operators simply will not know who and what is using their systems. They will not be able to keep a tag on that. Secondly, encryption, almost universal encryption, is just around the corner as well. And thirdly, the multiplicity of access to the internet and other forms of communication. At the moment, it's through computers, pads, iPads, through mobile telephones. In the future, it'll be cars, fridges, all sorts of other simple devices which will allow us to communicate. And that means that specific targeting is incredibly difficult, because not only do you need to know what the target is, you need to know what device he or she is going to use and to get into it, which is very, very difficult. And that is what leads us to big data. In other words, scoop it all up, and then when the time comes, you can use it to identify what's gone wrong, or indeed use a number of methods which are available to try to identify in advance that which might be dangerous to society. Who are we to trust? Democratic governments who have this data, who are there to protect us, or the private sector? And bear in mind, we're talking about our identity. And our identity, we share some of it, we don't share other parts of it. Even our identification, each of us has multiple identities. We have a home identity, we have a work identity, we have an online identity. We are different with family and friends than as we are in a gathering like this. We have an identity with the government, to vote, to pay taxes, to do business. And even what is our personal information? There is direct information, our name, our passport number. There is indirect information, for instance, how often I go to the pub, how often I go and buy condoms from the nearest chemist. All of these are personal information. And it depends on the context, how much of it we want to release to the world. Anonymity, as we heard earlier, is on the way out. Re-identification and tracking data, together with new procedures and the combination of various databases, means that this re-identification is very easy. Information in the private sector is marketed and run for the profit motive, whereas government uses this information to protect us, or that's how they should do it. That means that at the end of the day, privacy and surveillance has to be proportionate to that which is in all of our interests, and most of all, we should have the freedom to choose, because after all, we are a democracy, and that's what that is all about. But even in a democracy, as Bishop Berkeley said, few men think, yet all will have opinions. Thank you very much.
Jānis, thank you very much for captivating and highly informative opening remarks. I'm particularly glad that you touched upon the issue of private sector versus public sector surveillance, because the interplay of those two forces is one that interests and puzzles me greatly. One is tempted to think of private sector surveillance as being basically consensual and public sector surveillance as being basically imposed, but in practice they are obviously entwining more and more. What I take away mainly from your remarks is that we have been living, in a sense, in a golden age of surveillance, in which there was a manageable quality of relevant data was available to be analysed according to the correct procedures. But gradually, the increasing quantity of data is overwhelming those procedures and forcing us towards a world of greater automation, greater algorithmic control, which I think makes an excellent moment in which to invite Dr. Mueller into the conversation, since those questions of fundamental technological advance are very much at the centre of your thinking.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for inviting me, first of all. I was really happy to come to Riga. I have some ancestry from Riga. One of my ancestors was the mayor of Riga, actually, Willem Karkovius, so I was really happy to have a look at the place, which is beautiful. I just want to make 2 points today. I want to talk about what I call the classical view of surveillance, which I think is wrong. And the other point is that we're looking at an age of probably total surveillance, in particular horizontal surveillance. So I'll explain what that means in a second. First, the classical view. So you mentioned that the Snowden story, for example, that's one of the classical situations. So what is the normal response to that? So you see this stuff happening. Snowden tells you these stories. I think the majority of them weren't really news for people who were in the field already. I mean, not to mention people who are actually doing the work. But the normal response to it is, of course, outrageous, right? They're doing all this stuff. They're reading my email. They're listening to Merkel's phone. And, that's really nasty. And also they're not telling us that they're doing this stuff. So they're keeping it secret. Very bad. I want my privacy back. Right? That's the first response which one has to this. At the same time, we applaud what Snowden did. Right? So we think that at least I thought he was heroic, and he did a service to society, and so it's a really beautiful contribution, just like other things like WikiLeaks and other activities in this direction. Now, of course, what WikiLeaks and Snowden did was leaking information, right? So it's the opposite of privacy. What these people were doing was to take private information, how the NSA works, for example, and put it out into the open. So I see there is a tension here. I seem to want privacy for me, please, but not for them, please. Right? The other guys, they should not have privacy, so they should tell me everything they do, and people like you should have an absolutely open system which makes clear that how you're doing and what you're doing, and there should be a report and so on. But I want my privacy. That's something odd. And the same thing happens the other way around, right? The NSA wants to know everything about me, and you, and you, and you, and you. But they're not telling us anything about them. So everybody does the same thing. They want their privacy for themselves, but not for the others. And something odd is happening there, it seems to me. I'm not sure that's really a very tenable position. Obviously, there are some differences between institutions and individuals and so on. One can try to figure this out. But I got worried with my own sort of very convenient position about this. And the other worry is that we were looking at surveillance in a traditionally in a sort of top-down way, right? So surveillance happens from the powerful to the less powerful. So it's the state that surveils the citizens, and more recently, perhaps, it's companies that do that, right? It's actually a lot more private surveillance going on than state surveillance. So it's the powerful who have, as Marx would have said, the means of production, so to speak, right? The production of the data, and they have the power. They survey us. We don't want that. We want that power direction is something that bothers us. So that's the classical view of surveillance. We try to sort of defend ourselves against that power that comes down. I think so. This is now I'm coming to my second point. I think this is probably not going to be tenable in the long run, because what happens is that the means that the powerful have are becoming more and more accessible to the less powerful. So it would have been very hard in the old days to find out what letters you're writing to other people. For me, extremely difficult. And even to read the letters, it would be very tedious for a service like yours to read all the letters too. They would do that because they would have to actually employ lots of people, so they would be very selective. Right? If you can read all the letters electronically, as you can do now, then of course things change. Now, if I really want to know whether my wife is cheating on me, I do have some means available. I can buy cameras and microphones with almost no cost. I can install a little program on her mobile phone which tells me where she is, how she moves, whether the phone is moving rhythmically or not, and whether I can turn the microphone on or off. Well, I'm not sure that I want to do that, but anyway, I could. So I now have technical means of surveillance that were pretty much unthinkable a couple of years ago. So it seems to me that that's a development that we're facing. So surveillance can take this top-down direction, which is the classical ones. Then there are some people who think we should have surveillance the other way around. Some people call that surveillance. So it's sort of pseudo-French, right? Surveillance is sort of down, and then sous is from underneath. So we should watch the powerful, right? So police should be watched while they're doing their job in order to avoid police violence, for example. Sounds like a good idea, because otherwise, as everybody knows, convicting police of police violence is pretty much impossible, because no police people rat on other police, and so they always get away with that. So there is surveillance, but I think more importantly there's also the horizontal surveillance. So from me to you, and the means for that is just increasing enormously. A little while ago, a friend of mine wrote to me and said, "Oh, I see." He said, "I have this thing on my website," and I looked at it and he said, "Oh, I see you're in England," because I travel between Greece and England. I said, "How do you know that I'm in England?" Well, he said, "I looked at the log file of my website and I saw that there was this hit from this IP, which is Oxford, and so you're from there." Okay, this took him probably 5 minutes, but he could have done this in an automated way, right? To do that, quite easy. The question what surveillance is possible basically depends on three, I think, components. The one is sort of the data we generate, data production. And we generate a lot more data now than we used to, because our lives are a lot more digital than they used to be. Right? If we had had this conversation 20 years ago, probably there wouldn't have been any recording equipment in the room at all. Now we have about 100 cameras and microphones in the room, because every one of us has one in their pockets, right? And I have no idea how many pictures are taken of me right now. When Kodak came out with these portable cameras 100 years ago, or a bit less, people were outraged about the idea that you could actually go around and take a picture of just someone. Oh, they're sitting next to each other. There's a story. That was outrageous. Now we think, what? What was the issue exactly? People had cameras to carry? Okay, sure, everybody has a camera to carry now. So these things change, and the technological changes, I think, force the changes that we see. So the data production is the one part. We generate a lot more data because our lives are more digital, and there are a lot more sensors around, right? So we have cameras and video, we have motion sensors and all sorts of sensors. We will have all sorts of smart devices going on. They will all have sensors which generate digital data. The second point is the access to that data, which of course is what the officials are really trying to keep control over, right? They want the access and nobody else should get the access. I think that's eroding as well, right? The data is now on the internet. It's not so hard to hack quite often, and so people leave traces. Some people actually want that. There is the digital self. I don't know whether you've heard of this idea, that people actually track their own activities and their bodily functions, their blood pressure, and all sorts of other stuff for their medical purposes. And they usually put that on the internet. Right? So you can see what the guy's blood pressure was yesterday at 17 hours. So we generate a lot more of that data. We make it a lot more accessible. And then we also have a lot better means of analyzing it. Right? This friend of mine I talked about earlier looked at the actual log file, because he has a website which isn't all that popular, right? Now, that's of course an old-fashioned way of doing it, right? Normal people don't look at log files like that. You have a program that looks at the log file, okay? These programs that look at the log files and can make the links and find out who is doing what and with whom and so on, these are the things that are developing massively, and they can find out a lot of tracks out of stuff that you think has no meaning. And so, for example, the famous metadata that people were talking about about phones in the US. So we're not listening to your phones, we're just storing the metadata. Actually, the metadata has more information about a lot of stuff than the actual content. Because I now know that, well, he called me and I called him, and every time he calls me, I call him. And, well, there's something going on there between us. And obviously, he never calls him, so there's something there too, and so on. So there might be groups, patterns, and there's also interesting stuff. So all this stuff, the data production, the access to it, and the data analysis is increasing, and the technology is just going to make what we're doing now look totally silly in 20 years. And 20 years is not like a, 20 years is a relatively foreseeable time frame, and in that kind of time frame, I think the discussions we had today will seem sort of antique. I think we will likely have given up on surveillance, on privacy. It will just be the norm. There's all this data. Everybody can know everything about everybody else if they want, and we just have to live with it.
Vincent, thank you. Fascinating throughout. And a lot to think about there, and a lot of provocative ideas which are new to me. Notably, this change from, as it were, concealed surveillance to open surveillance. I think of surveillance as something that's basically asymmetric. You are hiding and you survey me. But it looks as though you're foreseeing a logic where this leads to a symmetry of surveillance, whereby everybody is surveying everybody else, and that's, in a sense, the only way that we can get social acceptance of surveillance and enough data with which to work. But in the meantime, it seems as though we're still in a world where surveillance is expected to be secret, and where governments want to keep it secret, and as they put more and more resources into it, so more and more of the government becomes sworn to the culture of secrecy and becomes insulated from accountability and becomes a capacity, in some senses, potentially uncoupled from the threat. And Rafael, I'd be very interested if you were to cast an eye on how this evolution of surveillance plays out in the democratic sphere, whether public opinion appears to be sensitive to the possibilities, and whether politicians appear to be sensitive to the possibilities, and the ways in which this is going to change what it means to govern.
Oh, thank you. Yes, excellent questions, which I will endeavour, but no doubt fail to answer. First of all, I should also say thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come back to Riga. I can only second the observation that it is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, so that's a real pleasure. Some of what I was planning to say has been said already, so I'll just sort of range across a few things that I think might contribute to the conversation, and look forward to getting some questions and a discussion that follows. We've heard quite a lot about the sort of rational arguments and how you break down the categories of what we consider freedom and privacy and how they change. As a journalist who writes mostly about politics, inevitably a lot of what I deal with is the emotional responses to these issues, and this was, I think, at the heart of Robert's question. And so I thought it was relevant to start with actually something that happened to me this morning when I checked out of my hotel room and I came downstairs to the Hotel Latvia. Oh, no, sorry, it's now the Radisson, isn't it? The Radisson Hotel Latvia. And I went to the desk and I checked out, and the young man said, "You had a bottle of mineral water?" And I said, "Yes, I did." "How did you know about my bottle of mineral water?" And he said, "Oh, we have sensors in the minibar." I said, "I know you have sensors in the minibar because it says there are sensors in the minibar, but my bottle of mineral water was on top of the minibar. It wasn't inside the minibar." And he said, "Yes, but we also have sensors that would check the weight." So I said, "Well, does this mean if I had picked up the bottle of mineral water but had not drunk the bottle of mineral water, you would still have charged me for the bottle of mineral water?" And he said, "Yes, you would then have to correct. That's why I ask." And I felt a tiny bit violated. Not in a substantial way, not robbed or deprived, or I don't think it's fair to say that I felt less free. And it's an important distinction. I was no less free for the man behind the desk at the Hotel Latvia knowing that I had some mineral water that morning than I had been before he knew, and yet I had lost something. So then I thought, what is the thing that I have lost in that transaction? Why am I worse off as a result of that transaction? And the only thing I can think of is what would the transaction once have looked like, and what would have happened. I've done a lot of staying in hotels. I've stayed in the Hotel Latvia in analogue days, and what would have happened, they would say, "Did you have anything from the minibar?" To which the response was, "Yes, I had a bottle of mineral water." "Okay, well, that will cost you." Well, it would have been a lat or two back then. So actually, the outcome would be the same, except the presumption would have been that I am in control of the information, and there would have been an element of trust that, when asked, I would yield the information that I had a bottle of mineral water. So I think, to an extent, that's what had been taken away from me. And that is why I had an emotional response. Rationally, as I say, my freedom was not curtailed. So that just brings us back to the sort of the premise of the discussion: surveillance and freedom. As has been said, we are presuming that they are sort of in tension with each other, and that if I'm being surveilled, I'm less free. That's as you said, that instinctively one feels that is true. Now, because we're celebrating Isaiah Berlin, and Isaiah Berlin's name has come up, I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not probably clever enough to be a philosopher, but I do remember when I first encountered reading Berlin and reading about Berlin, feeling tremendously liberated by the observation that I got from Berlin that you can have two completely contradictory propositions at exactly the same time, and that's okay. They can both be true. I can have a right, and you can have a right, and they can awfully conflict with one another, and you can just live with that. You don't need to aspire to a sort of overarching, single, coherent truth. That means that we decide whether my right trumps your right, or the other. And this seems very relevant to this debate, because, Robert, you mentioned the importance of negative freedom and difficulty in understanding positive freedom. I don't really understand either of them, so that makes my life that much easier. It strikes me there are two negative freedoms in tension here, though, in a way. I'm sure I will be corrected. I have the freedom, as it were, from molestation, the freedom to go about my business without being interfered with, or without being pursued, followed, without having that trust taken away from me. I also have the freedom to walk down the street without being attacked, blown up by terrorists, by bad guys. And so I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is that at some point I'm surrendering a degree of freedom. I'm giving permission to an authority to protect me from the bad guys. And then instrumental to that act is the confidence that the bad guys aren't actually the state, that the government is on my side. And this came up before. So the first test, really, in all of this, I suppose, and we'll come on to the private sector in a minute, because the Hotel Latvia, mercifully, is no longer run by the state. At least I don't think it is. So the test is whether the surveilling authority can meet some benchmark of democratic governance, as you said. Now, that means there is, at some stage, you have to have a mechanism that presumes that I have permission. So I've given you permission. I've given the authority permission to put me under surveillance. I suppose at some level we presume that permission is contained in the act of electing a government. Because, as you say, and has been said, there is an authority mandated there to protect me from people, and I expect my government to do that, and therefore contained in that action is protection. And I can withdraw that by changing a government if, for example, you have a revelation such as the Snowden one, and I am so appalled by this that I decide this government has violated me in a more profound way, and therefore I don't want them to be the government anymore. Interestingly, I agree with you that a lot of people were probably shocked by those Snowden revelations. I don't think they will have any substantial political impact at all. I do not think that people... I think liberal opinion is affronted by it, but actually, whether or not that is deemed to be something that renders an elected government illegitimate, I don't really see any evidence of that, actually. And actually, the opinion poll data, when you ask people questions across countries, but certainly in the UK, what they would be prepared to tolerate in terms of, well, what we think of as violations of freedom or civil liberties in the name of security, they are pretty brutal. In the aftermath of the 7th of July bombings, which, albeit was a time of great heightened emotion, an opinion poll survey was taken, and a majority of people would have favoured indefinite detention without charge of people suspected of involvement in terrorism, without any evidence being presented. So literally just interning people off the street. That's an enormously authoritarian act, and you could have, the government arguably could have got away with that. So, and they didn't. Well done, the government. I could go on forever, so I'll just make 2 points, really. If we're talking about permission, then, and we think this is such a fundamental issue in relation to the surveillance that I might or might not be under from the state, why am I so willing to click the box that says terms and conditions when I create a Gmail account or a Facebook account? And I'm giving all sorts of permissions in that act, of which I'm quite obviously unaware. Now, clearly, I am distinguishing very fundamentally in some way in my mind between the permission I give Facebook or Twitter or Google to just aggregate all my data, monitor me, and the more emotional response I have if I think that GCHQ or the NIA is reading my email. Now, what is that difference? And I don't actually know the answer to this, but I was struck that when in your remarks you made the distinction between a sort of a profit motive, which seems a little bit mercenary, and you think, well, here they are mining my data just for the benefit of their shareholders and to be greedy, whereas the beneficent democratic state is mining my data to protect me from being blown up by jihadi lunatics. So, well, surely the latter is preferable. But there's another way of looking at it, which is when you examine the motive of what's going on here, and going back to the bottled water, and where is the element of trust? When Gmail, for example, scans all my metadata and decides to serve me an ad, and the content. Oh, absolutely. No, they read them. I can read whatever they like. It's terribly boring. But I want to go on holiday to Greece, for example, and I do a little Google search of Greek holidays, and then, lo and behold, later that afternoon, I get an email, and it says, you know, the served ad is holidays in Greece. Well, they know something about me. But what have they presumed about me there? What is the presumption? The presumption is that I want to go on holiday to Greece. They have a commercial motive, but ultimately I do want to go on holiday to Greece. They've correctly understood that. What is the presumption when a state authority is trawling through my email, in theory, or your email? It is that I might be engaged in a criminal act. Or I might be doing up to no good. I might be a terrorist. I'm not, by the way. But again, of course, I would say that. Now, again, it strikes me that there is implicit, therefore, in the state authority presumption and the motive, an offence against me that is different from the one that I'm getting from Google. And therefore I am ultimately more relaxed because I am offended by the thought that I might be a terrorist when I'm not. I'm not offended by the thought that I might want to go on holiday to Greece, because I do. And generally it's a pretty innocent presumption. I don't necessarily have the answer to this, but it seems to me that it is quite normal for us to be very relaxed about what the private sector does, and indeed we are, because everyone clicks on that box that says, have you read the terms and conditions? None of you have read those terms and conditions. If the government sent you an email saying, could you just click on this box to authorise us to do, you would read it, and you probably wouldn't click, or a lot of people wouldn't. So something different is going on there. I don't know what it is. I've probably talked for long enough, so I think I'll stop.
Rafael, that was as delightful and as amusing as it was instructive, and I think joy throughout. I'm very sensitive to what you say about the public and private sector. What worries me there is I think that both the public and the private sector are pushing in the same direction. I would be much happier if one of them was a check on the other. And your additional data point that the people in general don't mind really only does strengthen the notion that this move towards the total surveillance society is, in our time at least, irreversible. So what happens when we get there? And if we're going to go there, then the question is, how do we minimise the downside of that new society and maximise the upside of surveillance? So, Stuart, you've done some thinking in that area.
Yes. Thanks for inviting me to Riga, which was great enough on its own, but thanks even more for inviting me to this talk, which is absolutely fabulous. I'm going to start with a hypothetical. Imagine you're just driving in the street, or cheerful, birds in the sky, happy thoughts, and the police car slams straight into you. This goes to court, and the police officer stands up in court and swears that you slammed into them. The police officer knows the judge. He's testified them before. Maybe they socialize together. They're part of the same authority system. And unless you're lucky enough to be very high up in that yourself, there is no way that your word is going to carry any weight. When it's the policeman's word against yours, you're lost. Now let's add a camera to this situation. If it's your camera and you filmed it, well, you take the evidence, you present it, you're fine, you're in the clear, you show what actually happened. What if the policeman had a camera? Well, then you can start harping about, if this is your story, prove it. You have the proof there, you have the recording, why will you not show it? It might not work, but in both cases you are in a much better position than when it was your word against the authority figure's word. There's something in economics called the theory of second best, which is that just basically there might be an ideal solution, but if you can't get the ideal solution, the second best solution might be something very different. Now, the ideal solution might be full privacy rights for everyone. But if we can't get that at all, the second best solution might be something really quite different. Now, I won't go too much into why I think privacy is impossible. People have touched on that before. I'll just go over a few minor things. The first one is cost. cameras and recording equipment and all sorts of similar things are on a Moore's law curve and are getting cheaper and cheaper. There's going to come a time where a small recording drone is going to be €5 in cost. In a world like that, it's going to be very different from our world today. A colleague of mine at the Future of Humanity Institute has run the figures, and he estimates that by the mid-2020s, the richest states could put all their population under surveillance 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By the mid-2030s, every country will be able to do that. The last one, incidentally, is Zimbabwe. The other one is that you might think that all this data cannot be interpreted by humans, but the AIs are getting good. The algorithms are getting good. Facebook, thank you, has just developed an algorithm that can recognize faces almost as well as humans can, and more developments are like that are in the pipeline. So we can't count on that bottleneck to save us. Google and Facebook have, as we've shown, what they've proved is that people are willing to give their privacy away for the slightest benefit, pretty much, for the slightest gain, if it's set up in the right way. And finally, and this might be in a certain sense the sort of most philosophically important point, suppose I wanted to keep this, what I'm saying, private to just you in the room there. Well, I'd have to make sure that none of your phones are recording. I'd have to set up some really invasive thing to either check your phones are not on or to disrupt their signals. I'd probably need to have people or drones or something looking behind those pillars. It basically seems that I need a whole surveillance apparatus to make sure that I'm not being surveilled. Similarly, for instance, suppose NSA and Google, but I repeat myself, come and put their hands on their heart and say, we promise we won't spy on you. We've got these laws, we've got these procedures. How am I going to know that they're following these unless I can see what they're doing, unless I have a surveillance ability into the heart of their decision making? So what I would, so what is my second best option? Well, the solution to too much surveillance all over the place is a lot more surveillance all over the place by everyone. The concept of surveillance is the idea of looking up. It's the idea that if the NSA is going to abuse its power, well, first of all, it has to find out information about me. It's done that. And then it has to use this information for some abuse of power purpose. It seems impossible to stop it at the first step, but if we can keep an eye on what is going on in the NSA, we can probably stop it at the second step. It's the extension of the democratic journalist ideal of keep track of what your government does and your government will behave better. There's been quite a lot of concepts written on this, like David Brin's The Transparent Society, and it does seem to be an equilibrium that could possibly work. First of all, unlike privacy, it doesn't fight against all these technological innovations, against the falling costs. It goes with them. Because as it gets harder for us to keep our information private, as Vincent touched upon, it gets harder for the large organizations to do it as well. Now I'll just touch on some of the advantages of general mass surveillance. The one that people immediately think of is less crime, and there is a certain extent to that's true. And with really mass surveillance, we're probably going to get a lot less of the obvious crime. But have you considered that we could also get a lot less police, and especially a lot less police powers? Now, police have lots of powers that you and I don't have. They can arrest you on vague suspicions, at least for short periods. They can search you. They can do a lot of stuff that we would never allow a private citizen to do. And why can they do this? Well, we grant it to them because, to a certain extent, we've decided they need it. They need to be able to investigate things. They need to be able to ensure security. when they don't know if anyone in a mob might have a weapon, they might have justification asking the mob to disperse. If they don't know who committed a crime, they need to be able to go through your stuff and try and figure out whether it was you or was somebody else. But if surveillance took over most of the work of policing, then these things no longer apply. They would know who in the crowd had a weapon and would know whether this is... And instead of asking the whole crowd to disperse, they could say, you there, please get rid of your weapon or come out of the crowd. They would... I think the police ideally would be restricted to a specific task, which is finding the people who have committed the specific crimes that the recordings show they have and go and arrest them. Now, I don't imagine that the police are going to be willing to do this on their own, but it's something that we could demand from them if we had a mass surveillance society. In a lot of situations, I've also noticed that mass surveillance can substitute for other negative restrictions that we put, like all the annoying and degrading queues in airports. They are there because of lack of information. You don't know if someone might have a weapon, a bomb. If mass surveillance can take over that task, which, let's be frank, that's not for a few decades at least, but if it could, there'd be no need for these queues at all. Similarly, we have nuclear scientists cannot go and explain to the public how to build a nuclear bomb. It's a minor restriction on free speech. But we could allow them to do this if we could track every single particle of fissile material throughout the world. And there are other sort of less extreme cases where we could allow more free speech in exchange for more surveillance. Other examples, an earthquake hits a city. What if the emergency services knew the location of every single person in the city, exactly where they were when the earthquake hit, or exactly where their phones were, which is getting to be equivalent? That would be tremendously life-saving, literally. Imagine also the amount of research you could do in this society. Epidemiology, I find, is in a bit of a rut at the moment, has trouble figuring out the true causes of various social ills, but with this kind of data, you probably would stand a good chance of finding more revolutionary discoveries like lead causing crime and smoking causing cancer. One other thing you could use it to fight against pandemics, and pandemics are the biggest killers in human history, bar nothing. If sort of some people start getting symptoms and start behaving in a different way, you could track them. You could tell them, get yourself vaccinated, get yourself cured, get yourself out of the public. You could have micro interventions like small quarantines. Micro-quarantines in specific areas, for instance, which we don't do now because it might be too expensive to close all the airports. But it might not be too expensive to close an airport for 5 hours, where the figures show that there's a particular spike in risk. And the mention of pandemics brings to the heart of what we do at the Future of Humanity Institute, which is to look at the big problems, the really big problems facing humanity, and pandemics are one of them. We call these the existential risks, the ones that could seriously threaten the continued existence of the human species as it currently is. Another one is nuclear war. There's still a risk of that around. And certain types of nuclear terrorism increase the risk of that. Surveillance could fight against that quite effectively. Synthetic biology, the ability of people to manipulate various cells or pathogens to do specific tasks or specific goals of the manipulator is another big risk. And there's practically no restrictions on those at the moment. But I really think that these are the important considerations. So instead of sort of looking at small and somewhat parochial privacy concerns, we should look at the whole surveillance debate in terms of how does it affect these existential risks? How does surveillance maybe increase the risk of a totalitarian drift? How does surveillance potentially fight against such a drift? And that I think that we should be focused on these large questions rather than on the smaller ones who, even if we get the smaller ones exactly right, it'll make far less difference to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart, for a very eye-opening and mind-opening talk. One question, am I right in presuming that we would need to have a very egalitarian society with very robust respect for human rights for your advantages to obtain from surveillance?
Not really.
And if I were to get a horribly infectious new disease, I would like it to be thought that the detection of that would result in my cure rather than my cremation.
Yeah, so I want to be clear that if you've got a bad government and you add surveillance, this just makes things worse. I'm saying that if you have an acceptable government and you add surveillance, there's no real indication that this is something that makes it worse. So we can go through statistics or comparisons on that later if you want. But it doesn't need to be very egalitarian. It needs to have some minimum quality. But even if it's unfair, unegalitarian, as long as it's not too unfair, you could still get the advantages. From preventing a pandemic, everybody that lives through that, instead of dying, gets the advantages of it. Even if the government is not that respectful, says you have the disease, go home, stay home, that's still probably better for you than the alternative, as long as you can sort of start looking up some stuff on your own and getting yourself out of circulation. And you don't need an egalitarian access to all these tools, as Vincent was pointing out. When you generate so much information, you leave so many holes. The idea is that somebody with some basic hacking knowledge, or just some collective, some journalists, as long as they can get into the NSA and apply reasonable statistical tools and algorithms to it, it doesn't matter that the NSA's algorithms are 10 million times more developed or whatever. We're still probably going to get enough information about what they're up to be able to control them, or to start to control. But as I said, I think this is the best alternative that we have, because I don't see any of the privacy restrictions actually making a difference. As was said before, you get a government to pass laws saying it can't look at things, and then you ask the government to enforce it, and then to reassure you that it is enforcing it.
Thank you. Now, I've quite unfairly and rudely filched for myself the pleasure of the first question already, but we're now into question and answer time. So please, if you have a point, a comment, or a question, then I'm going to stand, because there's not a rake to the room, so I can't easily see. Yes, let's say 3 questions at a time and hope that they more or less coincide. So 1, 2, 3. Thank you. And if, for the purposes of surveillance, if you could say your name first. Thank you.
Okay. Hi. My name is Alina, and what I wanted to ask, I like this idea of turning the eyes on the government or on the authorities, but wouldn't you think that they would have the temptation to try to prevent this, because it's not in their interest to sort of have the public look at them? So this sort of a competition of who watches who more, and that would be my question, and I hope you can answer.
Excellent question. And then behind you, the gentleman in the red shirt. Oh, no, I'm sorry, the blue shirt, yes.
Yeah, my name is Mike Collier. I'm a journalist as well, so I'd like to come back to Rafael's bottle of water, if possible, which I think is just a brilliant metaphor for this whole discussion that we're having. Do you think you would have felt the way that you do if you hadn't stayed in a hotel before, and most particularly in the Hotel Latvia, and used the minibar? Because it seems to me that maybe what we're talking about from this discussion, which I very much enjoyed, is that a sort of anxiety that the new freedoms we're receiving somehow don't quite match up to the old freedoms we feel are being given away, that we're somehow losing in the trade-off, because I'm sure the hotel would argue, well, we've given you the new freedom not to have to remember whether you took a bottle of water or anything stronger, whereas you feel that you have lost that sort of element of trust which was implicit in you as a guest before. So thank you.
I love that phrase, the new freedom not to have to remember. It sounds perfectly Orwellian. Now, there was... yes, Peter.
My name is Peter Stermanis. Regarding the big data, there would be an exponential growth in the amount of data, and there could be some very nasty people around who generate biased data, and eventually the system could break down. What do you think of this notion, please?
No, they're all excellent questions. I don't think they really conflate, so let's deal with them separately. Let me bat Alina's question to you, Jānis, if I may, since you have some direct experience of that side of the fence, as it were. Can you see an intelligence or security culture buying into this notion of mutual transparency, surveillance as well as surveillance?
I think this is a very valid question, and we have to look at who we are talking about, because you said government, you, Robert, said intelligence services, there are also parliaments, there are oversight committees, and while we live in an age where a very important intelligence service is in a position to put its veto on a Senate Select Committee report on the use of unjust methods against potential terrorists, torture, then of course we are at great risk. Now, that, I believe, is a battle which the Senate will win. The public will support the Senate, and I believe that the CIA will find that it has to behave in a different way. And what that means, to go back to answering your question, is that it is not the government, some unknown force, but indeed the people who you and your friends are prepared to vote for, and who you then hold to account. And I'm not saying that our system of government in Latvia or anywhere else, even in the European Union, is particularly good, but they need to be held to account, and this is where surveillance will help, because for political reasons they will want to do it to be seen to be doing the right thing, and therefore, because they have the authority over intelligence and other services, then in due course that will come to fruition as well. Of course, there will be resistance from intelligence services, because intelligence services are by definition very conservative. That's their nature. We have to understand that. We have to help them change with the way things are changing by persuading them at a relatively low level of their training system that that is in their services and their country's interests.
Right, and I think, Rafael, the bottle of water can only be for you.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, the extent to which, had I not experienced the analogue version, would I be alarmed by the digital one? I think the answer is almost certainly no. I would take it for granted. And there is quite a lot of evidence that there is simply a generational gap here between people who who have sort of grown up surrounded by the technology, and people who remember a time when obviously the procedures were more analog. I mean, I have relatively young children, and I've witnessed the extraordinary spectacle of them looking at a picture in a magazine and trying to swipe their finger across it and wondering why it doesn't respond. Interestingly, there is a friend of mine, this is just anecdote, it's not science, but a friend of mine did market research for a mobile phone company and found that there was a very clear distinction in the generations between people who, if they were standing in a group and had a phone call, the age at which people would remove themselves from the group and then take the call elsewhere, and those who would stay in the group and have the phone call, in the sense that they would not distinguish as much between the absence of that person physically from the conversation. It was bringing someone into the conversation, and that I think this was a few years ago, but sort of around 30 years old is the difference there in terms of how much people just take it as an intrinsic part of their world, that you can be present digitally but not necessarily in place. And there's a whole interesting area that has been looked at a bit, but not much. Is this sort of cognitively doing something to us? Physiologically, is there? Do our brains actually respond differently if we have always grown up on the assumption that someone who is available on Twitter or Facebook is present to us in the way that we are present to one another in this room? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it does prompt one other thought, which was something I wanted to say earlier, actually, which is that. And it's really a thought experiment, but it is possible that really, as far as as opposed to saying that we have no privacy and this is gone, this is a sort of a golden age of privacy, or to the extent that for most of recorded time, people would have been living in communities and environments where their churchman or their feudal lord or their religious community or their family would have known exactly what they were doing. They wouldn't have been able to, if they were lucky enough to own a horse or a donkey, they might have been able to go a few miles away from where they live. But other than that, everyone would have known absolutely everything about them, and they would have felt a very profound religious obligation to tell authority everything about themselves, including their innermost anxieties, desires and sins. So the fact that I can be thinking something and you don't know what it is, and I don't necessarily feel the fear of damnation as a result of that, is a tremendous freedom that is relatively new in history. So I wonder whether actually, thinking about this sort of neo-panopticon that you've described, where we all surveil each other and everyone knows everything, is this sort of a regression to a mean in some way, that just because there's so many of us, we need to recreate that sense of constant surveillance so we can generally keep each other in check? And if you were to look over the broad sweep of history, the amount of, I don't know how to put it, but sort of the amount of freedom that I have to do things without people knowing about it, sort of minus the amount that other people know about what I'm doing, will generally always net to zero, and it's kind of the same regardless of the technology.
I love that idea of people knowing about your donkey. I suppose an offshore donkey in your stables in the Cayman Islands would be so much use. Now, Vincent, I was going to steer the big data question to you, Vincent, in any case, so allow me to develop that a little bit and then leave you to speak to both, if I may. Because you, I think, advanced the notion of this kind of democratization of gadgets, so that eventually the capacity to pick up anecdotes will be available to all of us. But putting together big data, in other words, useful data for producing patterns and policies and intelligence, is, and presumably, I guess, will remain the province of large organizations. So, do you foresee a democratization of, there's some kind of turning the big data into a public commons so that it can't be abused, or do you think that big data will always produce an asymmetry in a surveillance society?
Okay, so let me first comment on what was your question there. Two comments. The first comment is that the answer to this question was already here on the table. That's because before us there was this youth debate here, and this table had the people who were saying privacy is dead and so on, and I'm just reading. It says, essentially, they don't argue that it's inherently bad, only that it's scary. Which is pretty, in a very short version what you said. So they've already done that prior to us. Of course, some things actually have changed, right? So having a donkey or not, we could have had a walk into a field, looked around, and then I could have told you this really dirty secret of mine. I would have felt bad about it and so on. But I could have been certain that nobody is listening. That is gone, right? Nobody in the world can now have a conversation where they are certain that nobody's listening. We've lost that. And I think that is an important change. So about the big data thing, which goes in a similar direction, I think this loss which I just indicated is essentially the result of technologies, right? That there are now these surveillance technologies which are so hard to detect that I cannot be certain that you don't have a microphone on you, even though I strip search you or something like that. I mean, in that case, that one's too obvious. You're hiding the other one that you're. So, and I think a similar thing applies to the big data thing too. I mean, so what is important for that? First of all, you need a lot of storage. Now that's getting cheaper at incredible rates, right? I mean, my first computer had 20 megabyte storage on the hard drive. Sorry, that was the second one. The first one didn't even have a hard drive, right? So 20 megabytes is laughable, right, in present-day terms. I mean, I have a lot more RAM now than 20 megabytes in my phone, right? So that kind of stuff is going to, as far as we know, is continuing to develop in the Moore's law fashion. That is, it doubles every 2 years, which means that it's exponential. So it's growing really, really fast. The technologies for analyzing this kind of stuff, well, these technologies are basically algorithms. So nothing prevents me from using an algorithm that somebody else has made up. In fact, I do this all the time, right? I buy algorithms and download algorithms, which I use. So machine learning technologies are getting better all the time too. So I think big data, if anything, is an area where my ability of doing stuff will approximate that of the state as it does in other areas too. So I was interested by what you said in the beginning, that you said there are some things where you think there are hurdles. So encryption, for example, is a hurdle that classical surveillance is facing. And I think that's an interesting question, because, of course, my theory is that essentially more technology always means that you'll have more surveillance being possible, whereas your view might be more, it's like an arms race, right? You know, you get smarter, and then I get smarter too, and so on. And every time we essentially don't really change the situation very much, right? But it seems to me, and that's one reason why I got interested in the discussion, is that it's an arms race, but the people who are defending privacy are losing. So, and I think losing big time, and that is the impression that I get, and that it seems to me is a technological fact as opposed to a social fact. It will then generate social facts like this one, right?
Can I just come in on that last?
We've only got 10 minutes, so could I bring in 3 more questions? And then okay. So Henry, and then 2 there. Yes.
I want to ask whether the increase in surveillance would reduce the danger of war. Talk about nuclear war and more conventional war. And to take an example, the war in Syria, would it have been less likely to happen if there had been more surveillance? And if so, which side would have benefited? Would Assad have benefited, or would the rebels?
And Eva?
Thank you for this fascinating debate. And my question is, why should anyone worry about protecting privacy, if at all, apart from philosophers?
Mm-hmm. And your neighbour, I think, also had his hand there.
Hi, my name is Ernest. I was wondering, you've spoken a lot about surveillance for crime prevention. Now, the problem with surveillance is that that's basically analysis of data, and from analysis of data you get patterns, and the way to break that is you break the pattern, you do something different. Now in crime prevention there are a lot of operational measures, like you can offer somebody a bribe and see if they take it. So my question is, in the new world of internet and connectivity, are those operational measures also going to change? Can you throw a bait out to somebody on the internet to see if they could take it? And if is that too much of a breach of privacy, or are we going to see that happening?
So, Stuart, would you like to lead off there?
Okay. Lots of really fun questions there. First of all, increase in surveillance, I think, can allow you to reduce the risk of war, mainly through countries spying effectively at each other. This allows countries that don't trust each other or that might hate each other to, for instance, mutually disarm if they choose to do that. And also, there's less temptations to surreptitiously build up an army because it won't be surreptitious, and if you start building up an army, your opponents start building up an army, and you've just wasted a lot of resources. So that kind of war is going to be reduced, I think, quite a lot by surveillance. In Syria, yes, surveillance would have prevented the Syrian war. Unfortunately, it would have done that by making Assad's regime more stable. Surveillance does make regimes more stable, including bad ones. Why protect privacy at all connects quite quickly to that. Well, you would want to protect it in places where you already have bad governments. You might want to protect it in places where you have bad social values, like, say, women in certain parts of the world whose lives are very controlled by their menfolk or by authority figures. And who have there's some very moving posts that I've read, but have just some small moments of freedom. And if you bring in mass surveillance, you might do away with things like that. You might also possibly reveal the hypocrisy of the ones who are controlling them, and that might have another effect. But there are arguments for privacy. I just think that, unfortunately, it's not going to fly. It's not going to happen. And crime prevention beta on the internet, well, we do that all the time now. If you want to go and buy fissile materials, I'm pretty sure you're not going to be talking with a genuine fissile material seller if you approach it the naive way. There probably will be less baits if you get more surveillance, because if you can actually stop people fast when they're actually doing the crime, the sort of, we got the person who might do this sort of plan in the future becomes less important.
Rafael, I'm going to co-opt you next, because I was thrilled that he ever asked the question that she did. Why should anyone worry about loss of privacy? Because, I worry about loss of privacy, but all through this discussion I've been thinking...
That's the question that I'm drawn to, actually, because it's such a good question. And partly, obviously, we should be defending philosophy here, as Isaiah Berlinde. The short answer is, I don't know, but my instinct is that the answer lies somewhere in what was said earlier about the relationship between privacy and identity. That somehow your sense of who you are, your integrity as a person, and the possibility of that being violated in some way is still bound up with our notion of privacy. And identity, in political terms, identity, who you are, who you trust, who you consider to be part of your own group and community, is probably what is the most animating force in politics. It has been behind some of the most effective political movements. It has been behind some of the most atrocious acts and wars. And so I don't know how we're meddling with it when we surrender privacy, but if we are meddling with it, then we should be pretty careful about considering the consequences of that. I would also, and this is going to be a slightly philosophical observation about this, the thing I found when hearing again this sort of panopticon account of more, the response to surveillance being more surveillance and surveillance and other sort of francophone variations on the theme of surveillance or valence. It occurs to me that this is a hyper-rational way of looking at the problem, because you can sort of mathematically aggregate all the different ways in which everyone's surveilling each other, and again you reach a sort of a happy mean where we all, if everyone keeps their hands where we can see them, no one can bring out the concealed weapon, metaphorically. Now, what I found myself thinking, and what I actually made a note of there, was a line from Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, where the narrator says 2 times 2 equals 4 is a good thing, but 2 times 2 equals 5 is also an excellent thing. And the point being that the sort of the history of human thought and the history of human behaviour is that whenever you posit something that seems in rational terms to be a sort of a systemic way of bringing equilibrium to society so it works, people will choose to behave irrationally to reassert their identity and reassert their sense of who they are. And that always happens, and ultimately I think you would find, in this environment, and I don't know how it would manifest itself, that people would actually choose to have the avian flu, or to have a heightened risk of being attacked by a terrorist, or whatever it is, because that is such a human instinct to say, I will actually bring harm upon myself in the interests of knowing that I have integrity as a human being.
Right. Okay, we're coming up to time. This is such an interesting question that I'm minded to ask if Vincent and then Jānis would speak to it to close. So, Vincent, why should we worry about loss of privacy?
Well, I've been playing the devil's advocate here so far, so I can see whether I can play the other advocate now. First of all, of course, in response to your question, the job of strange people like me and Stuart is to try and be rational, right, as far as we possibly can, and look at things in the long run, and we're really interested in cognitive biases and why people think the wrong ways and so on. So we really try to make sure that we get rid of all of that, and then try to see what's really a good idea. It seems to me that what privacy boils down to is that people just like it, and so that's pretty much that. So they say, okay, I want this to be private. I don't want you to know that, or to see me, or to come so close, or something like that. And that is the justification that I see for it. It's just that, as a matter of fact, people have this tendency, they do this kind of stuff. Some people more and some people less. Right? I just spent a couple of days in the United Arab Emirates, and there, of course, people think of privacy in a different way. It's very obvious. And showing your body, men and women, as really, is not something you do. It's indecent, right? And so my response to that is obviously, okay, sure, that's the way things are. In fact, when I went to the hotel bar in the evening, I thought people looked really strange around here, and that was because they were all Westerners and dressed, sort of like you and me now, and it struck me as really odd after 2 days, which was kind of strange. Anyway, so it seems to me the value is that people value it. So if people do value it, then we should try to support it. But the interesting thing is how flexible that is. Right? So the phone example that you mentioned is a very good example of that, how these things change. Phones used to be a really private affair. It was very rude behavior to start having a phone conversation next to someone else. And now people don't really understand what's supposed to be rude about that. And I'm sure if my ancestor Kerkovius would see the way I sit or talk, he would say, "Oh my God, what kind of a farmer is that? Why do you behave in this awful way?" So these things change, right? And what I'm suspecting is that they will change in the future. But so I think the only reason to care about it is that we do care about it. But that's a good reason.
Right. And Jānis, let me pass you the last word. What worries you when you think about a loss of privacy?
Maybe I can look at it from a slightly different way. But first, 2 words about bait. And there are indeed a number of terrorist trials which have fallen apart because of agent provocateur activity which has made somebody who might in other circumstances not have wanted to turn into a terrorist become a terrorist. Therefore, I think that's not the greatest of dangers. I'm now going to say two things which are contradictory between them. First of all, surveillance and war. Surveillance and war will lead to a different kind of war. Yes, I know that there's a wonderful book, Reed's book, There Will Never Be a Cyber War. I don't believe that. Of course, you can define war by the conventional ways, but let me put it to you as an audience that if you go out now and find that there is not a single bankomat working in Riga, and you go to the bank and you can't do any transactions electronically, you will be pretty upset within a very short time period. Now, I put it to you even further. If somebody managed to get into the software of the electricity which makes all these things happen, then you'll be a great deal more upset. And these are the sort of things that we will be needing to think about. Just to go back a little, at the same time, somebody said, I think it was you, that there will always be a tendency for one side to get ahead of the other side, and then you get to some sort of equilibrium. Well, when it comes to cyber warfare, it always reminds me of the European view of bombers before the Second World War. The bomber will always get through. Well, as we know, thank God it didn't. Finally, on privacy, I have to admit that I am not convinced by the threat to privacy that we've been talking about. As somebody who has, over many years now, participated in discussions which were held in conditions of absolute, so we thought, electronic privacy, but with a lot of ways of trying to ensure that that is the case. Technology is not that brilliant. Technology breaks down. And if you really think that very quickly we'll have some way of seeing why man in red shirt in the middle of the crowd actually has a weapon, I'm not quite sure what sort of technology that would have to be. I mean, maybe there is and maybe there will be. But I believe that human beings naturally will find ways of maintaining a level of privacy, because that is how we are, and that is indeed what Rafael was saying, that people will do things which are not necessarily in their own interest, in the same way as countries do things which are not necessarily in their own interests, because they have other reasons for doing them. And privacy, though we can't define it in philosophical terms as a negative or a positive freedom very easily, probably is one of those things which we are not in the modern world prepared to give up, and therefore I am an optimist in this respect.
Thank you. Well, Janis, Vincent, Rafael, Stuart, I'd like to say that it's been an absolutely thrilling discussion. I've enjoyed it throughout, and I'm extremely proud to have been associated with it as a moderator. Thank you, three of you, for coming to Riga. Thank you, Janis, for coming here. I hope you'll stay on to enjoy the rest of the day. I do trust you have programs. There's a break now. There is an outstandingly good film at about 4:30 featuring a certain walk-on extra who may seem faintly familiar to you. And then after another half-hour break at 6:30, we'll be having the great event of the day, the Isaiah Berlin lecture with President Ilves. So once again, thanks to the panel for a marvellous afternoon.